Okay, in this video, I'm going to be looking at this area in Africa, in the Nambia, Botswana area. This is on the southern end of Africa. And let's just first zoom into this alluvial fan. That's one of the most prominent alluvial fans in the world. It's very clearly an underwater deposit based upon the shallow gradient of this feature. So all of this debris was deposited completely underwater. Now let's get a width on this alluvial fan. It's hard to, exactly estimate where it ends, but it looks like it comes around something like that. 100, almost 140 miles. Depends on how you measure it, but it's a massive fan, clear, definitely over 100 miles. But let's take a look at these amazing lines that are so perfect. What can cause such perfect lines of sediment? If we were in Canada, we would easily say these were drumlins, but here in at this latitude, it's really hard to have a theory of an ice sheet on this land. So how do we get these abrupt features? And let's just check the width on them. Let's get a good width on this guy. Over a mile wide. So these are very, very prominent features. And you can see I'm not sure how high these are. It looks like they're around, we could get a little estimate, 1,050 meters. They're about 30 meters high. So that's about 90 feet. So these are about 100 feet thick and a mile wide. Now, this entire landscape is covered in these perfect drumlins. Now, this right here, you see how clean this edge is and how these drumlins stop so abruptly? The reason why that is so abrupt and clear is because after these were formed and deposited, a water current came through here and made this little edge. That's a little cliff edge or a riverbank edge from a water current, right? And so we see that this is the alluvial fan, which was deposited underwater. These were all formed underwater. I'll explain the fluid dynamics of these drumlins momentarily. But we can see that if this had an expansion bar, and if water came from this way as well, then that would explain why this cliff edge is so clear. And then we kind of get to a spot where there's drumlins in this area as well. So it wasn't a very long-lasting current, but there definitely was a current to make such a clean end of these drumlins. Okay, we can go over here, find perfect drumlins. See how they end clearly here? That's because the river came through here and washed them away on the other side of the riverbank. And then in line with these, we find scours, and they're directional scours, so you can see the triangular shape to them. This being the upstream edge, called the scarp edge, and this being the tail. Right, this one's got a more clear tail, nice point to it. This has got a good tail on it, really helps us see the current direction. And so that's just like what we find here in Oregon. This is a massive canyon in Oregon. The Oregon Salt Scablands, if you're familiar with my channel, I've discussed this. But for my new followers, I just wanted to briefly explain these lakes, which are directional. And they also show the scarp edge, and they also have the tail, which is downstream. And all these little scours here, they're all formed by water. Lots of fluvial features on that landscape. So now that we understand that, we can keep going. And let's see if we can see anything else that indicates a water current. We're going to start seeing some streamlined features, right? This kind of looks streamlined. This definitely looks streamlined. But there's a lot. This is somewhat streamlined. Here we've got 3 streamlined features right on top of each other. 1, 2, 3. Normally a river makes a herringbone pattern where the main stream is in between the tributaries, but with the streamlined feature, you don't have that central mainstream. Okay, let's keep going. Let's go a little bit lower. There we go. Now we're in some nice drumlin country. Really prominent, perfect drumlins. And what is this? A massive streamlined feature? Let's get the width. 6.7 miles. And keep in mind, these drumlins are almost all a mile wide. So this is 6 to 7 drumlins. Really nice streamlined feature. And then you can see there's a micro streamline, or not micro, but a smaller streamlined feature right in front of it. And then we got this big streamlined feature. Here's another streamlined feature. Another streamlined feature. And you can really go on this landscape and find a lot of cool stuff. But I'm going to now explain to you how this massive drumlin field of perfect drumlins with a slight curve to it, you can see they kind of swing around this landscape here. Looks like they've been subdivided by a river right here. Then you got some mounds here. Now I'm going to explain to you how these drumlins form scientifically, but I'm going to let this video explain it. Understanding the laminar flow and turbulent flow. So check out this video.
Here we have an example of the laminar flow regime. It's characterized by smooth, even flow. The fluid is moving horizontally in layers, and there is a minimal amount of mixing between layers. As we increase the flow velocity, we begin to see some bursts of random motion. This is the start of the transition between the laminar and turbulent regimes. If we continue increasing the velocity, we end up with fully turbulent flow. Turbulent flow is characterized by chaotic movement and contains swirling regions called eddies. The chaotic motion and eddies result in significant mixing of the fluid. If we record the velocity at a single point in steady laminar flow, we'll get data that looks like this. There are no random velocity fluctuations, and so, in general...
So it's a very consistent velocity. And then with the turbulent, it's, he's going to say it's more up and down, it's got more variation.
For turbulent flow, we'll get data that looks like this.
Right, it's not a smooth velocity. So this is saying, it doesn't exactly tell us the water speed, but we know for a fact that a current of sheet water flow, right? So this entire landscape was under, how many feet of water? 30 feet, 100 feet, more than that? I don't know. But there was a sheet of water that flowed right over this, and it was a very clean flow. It had little turbulence. It was a very smooth, and it had a very consistent velocity. So that's actually a lot of interesting information we get from these drumlins. And it can't be from wind, because wind isn't powerful enough to make such clean and large features. A wind tunnel simply cannot recreate these features. But with a heavy fluid, such as water, right? Because air and water are both fluids, but the difference is air is a very light fluid. Water, being a heavy fluid, is able to carve, and it's also able to hold a lot of material in suspension for a long period of time. Now, another feature that's going to indicate water flow is these scours, right? So we've already seen scours in other places around here, and obviously wind cannot dig out a trough, right? Much less fill it with salt as well. So that gives us some indication that this might be sheet water flow from the ocean because we find massive salt pans. Now, I've already explained to you the scarp edge being the upstream edge of a scour. And we can see on this edge, we get kind of like a tail coming off of here. Not exactly a perfect pointed tail, but we do see somewhat of a tail indicated by this point here. And this is clearly the front edge, this upstream scarp edge. But this feature here is actually very shaped very cool because it reminds me a lot of what we find in Ukraine/Russia area. This is the Dead Sea, right? There's the Caspian Sea. It's the Dead Sea. And so, well, let's just talk about this spot first. This is an expansion bar, right? So when water, this is a simple feature of fluid dynamics. When water is concentrated and uphill, then it goes downhill, hits a water level, and expands, right? So water has a focusing force and an expanding force. So this is an expansion bar from the expanding force of water. That's why this line is so cleanly straight, because that's an accretion ridge from an expansion bar, and that's also part of the expansion bar. We go through here, we find a lot of scours, horizontal scours. I'll tell you a little bit what horizontal scours indicate. But this big feature here looks just like what we find in Nambia, because it's got that really clean scarp edge, and then it goes this way. It's the same rectangular type of shape, and then it's got somewhat of a tail, pointed tail. And we keep going with that, and it also lines up with drumlins, right? There's drumlins in line with that. They're farther away, but nonetheless, these are, and check out the salt, right? This is going to be a common feature we find, indicating that it was sheet water flow from the ocean, right? The Dead Sea, the Caspian Sea, they're both salt bodies of water. So we got this in line. We've got drumlins over here. I mean, these are big features here. These ones are hard to interpret what exactly these are, but we can go over here, find, this is a good spot of drumlins, right? Somewhat in line with, and also very salty. And then you can find some that are kind of more pointed. You can find some with a nice steep ridge on them. Right, so these are not made by an ice sheet because ice sheet isn't correlated with so much salt deposit, right? There's also no example of anything related to physics that allows a drumlin to make, or allows an ice sheet to make a drumlin. Here we've got parallel river channels, river scours, right? Another indication of sheet water flow, right? That's also the laminar force making all of these parallel to one another. Horizontal scours in the landscape. I'll tell you what that means later. So yeah, this reminds me of Nambia, but we're right by the Dead Sea. So just want to make that connection. Then we go over here, we find horizontal scours, triangular scours. So what's up with the horizontal scours? Well, I'll explain to you, let me just explain to you how you can get a scour. There's three features of water, three principles of fluid dynamics that explains how water can dig out a scour. The first is the undulating force of a water current. So for example, in this landscape here in Australia, these are corrugated ripple patterns, right? This is the cataract feature that's in line with the water current. And then these drumlins are perpendicular. So you've got the undulating force of the water digging the scour. That's one way. The other way is you've got the focusing force of water. So water tends to focus towards a trough, or focus in general, like a ravine has water focusing towards its center. So when water, even though it's under sheet water flow, water can still focus. So that's the focusing force. You got the undulating force, you've got the focusing force. And then the third is the turbulent force, which is like from an eddy, so it's a vortex, so it's a spinning force. So when we look at, let's just go to some nice scours over here. It's all scoured up. We got nice drumlins here. This is a different current direction, but we can go here, find a lot of scours, right? We can find some ripples. We can find some other features, but look at all this look at all these scours, right? These are actually parallel with the water current, in my opinion. And you can tell that because of the plunge pools, which are in line with the cataracts, right? So water came through here, had a plunge pool, which means it had an undulating force that mostly dug this. But with all of these scouring landscapes, if you imagine that we're not exactly dealing with perfect laminar flow, but it also has some turbulence, well, then you've got eddies, then you've got the undulating force, and then you've got the focusing force. So when you find drum or scours like this, you can find them. They tend to be in lines, right? That's because of the water paths. But you have three features to consider, and wind has none of those. Wind doesn't have an undulating force that's strong enough to dig out a scour or a focusing or a turbulent force able to dig something so deep. And then, of course, deposit salt on it. Okay, let's go back to our little spot, our topic of the video. Let's look at this feature here. Right, we see this is a river scour, right? And then we come through here. We see drumlins cross-cutting this feature, but we can see how this is all kind of in line with a path, right? We can see how this is a nice wide riverbank. Nice and straight, somewhat terraced on top. So we go from nice wide riverbank. We come down, we follow the river, it turns. Now there are tectonic forces that have somewhat to do with these landscapes, but you also have to understand that water definitely played a role. Came through here, lines up with this, and then it lines up with this as well, that trough. So you can see a little pattern, and then from here you can't see anything because it's very flat. And then let's look at this feature here. Oh my gosh, this is a moraine. You guys, it was ice sheets that did all this. Well, you have to understand that yes, an ice sheet can make a moraine, which is that's what they'd call this if this was in North America somewhere close to glacier country, even remotely close to it. But no, this is an accretion ridge, so this is something water can make. But it's not just that simple, because you have to understand that this is also somewhat parallel to these drumlins. So you've also got that sweeping flow coming across here that could be also responsible for that, what looks like a lateral moraine, but it's actually an accretion ridge. So when water came down here, it was able to accumulate all of this. And it also indicates that maybe a water current flowed back this way to make this bar, right? So you can find, just like when we go here. Okay, you see this, how it's an accretion ridge? Water pushed this up and made this bar. That's exactly what this is. So you go to a barrier island, any barrier island really, that's made out of sand, it's an accretion ridge, right? That's just a little piece of insight. Now let's go, and then we see some directional lakes, right? And these are in line with the drumlins, same current direction. Okay, now that we've seen the main features here, and we've seen how there's streamlined features and all that, we are going to, I've got some pins of mounds. Now, mounds are the world's most widespread geologic mystery, and they're a fluvial feature. So let's take a look at these ones here. So on these drumlins, right? It's all drumlins, laminar flow. We find really nice mounds, right? How did these mounds get formed? Well, they were sand or sediment or soil that has been subdivided and removed in such a way that only mounds are left. That's how mounds form. Okay. So it's a very cool landscape. Go in here. We find mounds. We find drumlins. Perpendicular to the drumlins are ripples. Right? So how much confirmation do we need, that we are looking at a fluvial landscape of sheet water flow? Well, there's a lot to indicate it. Look at all these ripples, right? 100 feet at least on all of these. You can see how the ripples kind of bend around this drumlin. Kind of has an angle to it. And then right next to the ripples are the mounds. Okay, now I've got a really cool location. I mean, this whole location is sick because there's so many ripples. It's just a fantastic location. And also those troughs are too deep to be created by wind. But this location here, I'll zoom out so you can find it. At this little cove, you zoom in up onto this bank, one of the best mounds in the entire world. Big old mounds. And they're mounds on top of mounds. And these mounds actually give us a lot of insight on mound formations. This is a type of mound that I call egg mounds because they've got, looks like a yolk in the middle, and then it looks like they got the egg white around it. And these egg type of mounds are the largest in the world. This is almost a mile, or it is a mile wide. So yeah, they're really big mounds. And you can see how, you zoom out, you can see this is a river channel. You can see how these river channels subdivide the mounds. And then you zoom in even more, and then you find how the river also subdivided the smaller mounds. Yeah, so very interesting fluvial landscape. You got some parallel features, right? So when do you want to call this? Would you call this a drumlin and then this a mound? Right? You could. But they're all fluvial features. That's the point. These are very clear and distinct, and these, I'm sure they're probably like, at least 30, 50 feet tall. They seem, these bigger ones here must be.
I didn't get that.
Oh.
Could you try again?
Nope. Siri, stop. Go away. Sorry about that. Let's measure from the trough. What are these little? We're at 24 meters here. And up here we're at 31 meters. So 7 meters, that's like, 22, 23 feet. So they're pretty decent. But, for being a mile wide, that's actually kind of shallow. But this landscape is just insane for mounds. And then a lot of river channels. Now I'm going to contrast that landscape with, actually I'm just going to use this since I got the pin on. If you go up to another spot that's got really cool egg mounds, or up here, this is Kazakhstan, right? So that's our cool feature over here, indicating a water current. We got our drumlins right here, and then we zoom in here, and we also find really cool egg-shaped mounds. Let's see if I can find one with a nice yolk on it. Oh yeah, that's for breakfast right there. Look at that guy. Let's get a full width on them. We could go the length of it. You know, that might be cheating. 4.8 miles. I mean, that's insanely massive. And then instead of these ones having mounds around the egg white, I mean, I guess they have a few mounds around them, but they mostly have ripples. 1/10 of a mile in wavelength, so there's decent ripples. Then you've got salt scablands in between them, full of salt scours, so you guys know what that means. And they're also somewhat parallel, so now we've got an indication of somewhat of laminar flow, which is an indication of sheet water flow. So yeah, that's a cool landscape. And then we got the drumlins right down here. We've got a nice curving, look at this curve. So yeah, clearly a water current is able to make such a tight turn. But of course, people are going to probably be in the comments saying, oh, that's from an ice sheet. Well, you can believe that if you want, but I'm just going to tell you, I don't think an ice sheet can make a nice sweeping turn like that. But